Hello, everyone. We're living in a crazy, dark time in a lot of ways. Even the most optimistic, love and light person has got to admit this is not this is not anyone's ideal moment in history. And some of these things are completely out of our individual control. That maybe the only thing we can do is to continue to talk about them with each other. And this came to me the other day pretty strongly, and I hasn't left my mind since, and I kind of think it's worth a conversation. We have so many more dystopias than utopias in our art and in our media, our short stories, our books, our films. It's like humanity can imagine a dystopia 1,000 different ways. We could come up with those all day. We could probably never run out of ways, right? But on the flip side of that, our ability to imagine utopia at all is incredibly limited. Even just bringing up the word, the concept itself, is to basically open yourself up to almost immediate ridicule. Even if you just want to have a philosophical discussion about it, just bringing it up, even in that context, will get jokes made at your expense and snarky comments thrown at you. And the other day, I asked ChatGPT to first define dystopian film, which it did easily. It says a dystopian film is a type of movie that presents an imaginary world that's oppressive, bleak, and often characterized by a totalitarian government, environmental disaster, or technological advancement gone awry. In a dystopian film, the society portrayed is typically one in which people live in constant fear, they struggle to survive, and often have limited personal freedoms. The story often revolves around a protagonist who attempts to change the status quo, or reveal the truth about their society, or overthrow the oppressive regime. A lot of times it's a combination of all of those. And then it says examples include The Matrix, Blade Runner, Hunger Games, in 1984. I then asked it to give me 100 examples, which it was able to do quickly and easily. Although once it started getting towards the end, it kind of repeated a few more than once. I don't know why it does that. But for the most part, it was able to quickly spit out almost 100 movies in seconds. Then I asked it to define a utopian film, which it defined as a movie that presents an idealistic world or society often characterized by peace, prosperity, and social harmony. In a utopian film, the society portrayed is typically one in which people live in a perfect, idealistic world without any major problems or conflicts. The story often revolves around characters who explore this utopia and discover its benefits and reflect on how it contrasts with the real world. When, however, I asked the AI to give me a list of utopian films, it took longer, it was a lot more pauses, and what came back was all jacked up. Because most of the films on the so called utopia list, or the so called utopias as portrayed in film, are actually really just dystopias. And it's not even really, I guess you could say it's all subjective, but most, I would say most people, an overwhelming majority of people, would not want to live in the Truman Show. They don't want to live in a world where everybody is lying to them and they're being watched and recorded and filmed even in the bathroom. Like most people would not consider that to be utopian just because you get to have a picket fence and live near the ocean. But your trade off for that is to live like that. Most people would not consider that to be a utopia. So most of the examples on the list are actually not, it's double sided. ChatGPT and AI bots like ChatGPT have no actual knowledge of these underlying concepts. They just make predictions, right? But that having been said, ChatGPT hasn't been programmed to be able to give anything useful in terms of utopia other than the basic definition. Because it's as if humanity itself doesn't seem to have a working concept of this idea. And even if you say it's all subjective, we can come together to have ideas of what dystopia is just easily enough that we can just come up with them all day long. So, subjective, yes, but that's only a good excuse for why we don't have more of these to a point, I would say. Why don't we have anything of equal value on the other side of that equation? Why don't we have concepts for utopia that are as strong? Why are we not even allowed to have the conversation without ridiculing ourselves for even thinking that it's possible? That's pretty disturbing. At least it is to me. One of the main points that wasn't included in the AI's definition of dystopia, and to me it's one of the most glaring, obvious points, is how desensitized and disconnected from their own humanity the people living in these dystopic realities always seem to be, as humanity volleys back and forth between the goalposts of Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And so it's really kind of striking that it wasn't included in the definition, because the examples of this are as ubiquitous as our dystopias. You have movies where people are so desensitized to terror that the world is literally exploding all around them and they just ignore it. Films like Children of Men and Terry Gilliam's Brazil.
I saw the most wonderful idea for Christmas presents at the chemist.
Films like Soylent Green, where people are just stepping over starving homeless people in droves like it's just nothing. The Hunger Games series, which is basically Shirley Jackson's The Lottery meets Battle Royale, where the state is so tyrannical that it's gotten everyone to accept sending kids off to like a state-sanctioned murder game as a matter of course. Films like Rollerball, where the corporations and the machines have taken over and it gets to the point where people are blowing up trees just to feel something, which leads into, say, a Clockwork Orange scenario where society has become so boring and gray and stifled and stilted and basically pointless, really, that going to total extremes appears to be the only way people know to make themselves feel anything, even when those extremes are absolutely horrific. You have Godard's Alphaville, which is one of my personal favorites, where emotion has been completely outlawed. Or THX 1138 or 2001 A Space Odyssey, where the people are so desensitized and emotionless that there's very little difference between the cold machines they use and the people who are using those cold machines. Down to, say, Fassbinder's World on a Wire, where people are so utterly void of emotion altogether that you begin to wonder if they're even human at all, or if they're just avatars in a simulation.
Each day is more wonderful than the last, where it will be possible for you to obtain the fulfillment of every fantasy.
Then you start getting to places like Logan's Run or H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, where humanity's grown so ignorant and learned such a helplessness over time that people just walk willingly right into their own death with a smile on their face. They don't even know what that is. Or The Giver, where people's emotions have been chemically castrated and they literally forgot what murder is. And that's the one I wrote about on X a few days ago. In The Giver, where the guy is euthanizing children and he doesn't even realize that he's killing them because he believes he's releasing them to a better place because that's what the system has told him. Where you literally forego your own feelings and thoughts to a point that it's just replaced by whatever the state tells you instantly without any consideration of whether that's right or wrong.
We are living a life of shadows.
And I wonder if it's just me or when other people watch these movies, do you ever consider the deep levels of conditioning, the generational conditioning that must have taken place over a great period of time, propaganda, censorship, and brainwashing, and that's to say the least of it, that must have happened prior to the time portrayed in these films, in these books, in order to get people to a point where they are that disconnected. We're talking well past apathy. So the question is, how does humanity get to that point where their hearts have grown not just cold, but seemingly useless? A level of desensitization that leaves humanity dehumanized. Like the light in their souls has gone out. I'm looking around at some of the things that have happened in the last few years and that are happening right now, and I feel like it's a discussion that should be had. Because we're living in a post-industrial world. And we've all been heavily conditioned for decades upon decades that the only thing that can mean is a dystopia, right? If we're in a post-industrial world, that's basically synonymous with dystopia. If you say post-industrial world, it's like it's a synonym for dystopia. But that's the world we're living in. And it's not just because of all of our dystopic films. It's not just the conditioning of our media and art, which you could say is a top-down thing that's been happening, or you could say it's what people are warning against because they don't want to live in there, but it's becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Either way, this isn't the only issue. I mean, we just came out of the 20th century. Not everyone listening to me was born in the 20th century, but a lot of you were. And you guys know literally every major technology that man came up with has been weaponized to at least some degree. I mean, as soon as they came up with telecommunications tech, they were spying on people and invading people's privacy. They were spying on people's telegrams. We reported on this before. They were spying on telegrams. They spied on people's mail before that. I mean, you can tell that some of the letters that were written in the lead up to the American Revolution, the people who wrote them know they're going to be read by someone else and they're not private. They know they're going to be spied on.
In 1903, on the plains of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, this history began. In the granddaddy of all modern planes, the Wright brothers won immortality by sustaining flight in a heavier-than-air flying machine.
They always show that video of the Wright brothers, their cute little plane prototype, which they first proved in the first manned flight of 1903. I thought it was 1904 for some reason, but then I went and looked it up. It was 1903.
There is no fuss or ceremony, no cheering crowds. The motors sputter and catch, weights drop, the ship catapults off the ground into the air for the first flight on record.
And that video is supposed to fill everyone with this awe at the wonder of man's inventiveness, right? We're all going to fly like birds. Wow. But just as soon as they made that freaking thing, their very next step was to turn around and walk to the military, okay, and try to figure out a way to turn it into a warplane. That was the very next thing they thought to do. It wasn't even a question in their minds of what to do with this technology. They just turn around immediately. This is on the Hill Aerospace Museum website for the Hill Air Force Base out of Utah. The Wright brothers are synonymous with flying, and they played an incredibly important role in the invention of the first warplane. After the brothers' famous inaugural manned flight in 1903, they almost immediately began working on an aircraft that could be used by the military. And at the outset of World War I, these newly developed flying machines filled the skies above the battlegrounds. So World War I was the warplanes' proving ground.
Life above the trenches was about to take a violent turn.
Using such weapons as flechettes, which is a steel dart, bricks. Several enterprising airmen even thought about the possibility of taking grappling hooks on ropes, dragging them along behind the aircraft with the hopes that they might snag another aircraft.
And basically, as soon as they had a working plane, man's gonna fly like a bird, they were immediately figuring out how they could transform that into an efficient death machine from the sky.
Just looks at him and says, "See that? It's that wretched bird that haunts us."
And you could play this game with a lot of our technology. It's very sad. I mean, there have been tons of studies on television and violence.
It's okay. We saw it on the television.
Bulletin from CBS News. President Kennedy has been shot by a would-be assassin in Dallas, Texas. Stay tuned to CBS News for further details. Only two.
It takes more than an instant to make a real cup of coffee.
There have been experiments with subliminal messages on television.
Ladies and gentlemen, this commercial is going to use subliminal advertising.
I could go on and on there. I mean, you just really can't name one major technology in the last century that's been created that wasn't somehow either created by the military, for the military, by defense contractors. It was a military thing before it got into the hands of the public, computers, or the internet, which was actually called ARPANET, IARPA, DARPA, first or foremost, or a technology that was invented and that first or foremost was not immediately weaponized by the military for one reason or another. And that's not counting all the patents that get classified to keep humanity in a certain level of technology at any given time, which is very highly controlled, which we've also talked about in other videos. Because that's a thing.
Apparently everybody who tries to do anything having to do with alternative energy ends up, well, just a little bit harassed. Possibly. A little bit.
If you come up with something that they determine is a threat to national security, which means a lot more things than most people realize it means, it automatically gets classified and you get threatened with federal prison if you talk about it or make it public in any way.
Sit down, Pete. Who do you think you are? Never mind that.
So there's a lot of stuff that I'm sure has been made, and there's a reason why people feel like we're in some technological bubble.
It's Dieter and Andy. Join us next time on Debunk when we take on free energy machines.
Yeah. What is all this stupid crap you're trying to build anyway? If it doesn't have one of these, it's not going to work.
See this engine? It can't run on water.
Yeah.
Join us Wednesday on Debunk.
Yeah.
And that stuff we don't have that stuff. Why don't we have it? That's probably one of the reasons we don't. Because everything is being held in a very specific bubble of technology that we're allowed to know and have. Even modern day psychology is another technology that has absolutely been weaponized.
The rat, wanting brain stimulation, would brave a shock stronger than even a starving rat would brave to get food.
This shows a rat is willing to pay a very high price in order to get to the pedal.
Human addicts will pay just as high a price for their rewards.
Thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them to really understand it. That thought process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you more likes and comments. I mean, it's a social validation feedback loop. I mean, it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology.
Which we talked about in The Minds of Men, which discusses at length the CIA's unethical MKUltra project and the use of mind control in every form they could possibly think of. They even used it to turn society into a bunch of patriotic consumers, which they've done time and time again.
Now, the American people have got to go about their business. We cannot let the terrorists achieve the objective of frightening our nation to the point where we don't conduct business, where people don't shop. That's their intention.
We must also work together to achieve important goals for the American people here at home. This work begins with keeping our economy growing. And I encourage you all to go shopping more.
And at some point, it's like we became a product. Our lives became utterly commodified. I mean, if you were born in the 20th or 21st century and you're listening to this, you have some idea of what I mean because it's literally all around you. But now we're in this era of externalization where we're all online. And we've become a lot more disconnected physically from one another in terms of community, a lot of us, as we've become seemingly more connected into this internet world that's everywhere and yet it's nowhere.
If you're looking at your phone, you're probably not going to see the sign that tells you not to look at your phone.
People have gotten to a point in real life or whatever this reality is we appear to physically inhabit with one another, where crimes will happen right in front of them. And instead of helping someone or screaming or doing anything about it at all, they pull out a phone and film it, which is not what you do if you're just so scared you can't react. You don't pull out a phone and film it. This is going a level beyond, okay? It's not just people are so afraid to help, they have to pull out a phone. It's like they don't connect with the fact that it's reality in front of them anymore. It's like they're completely disconnected from that person. Because if they were being attacked, they'd want someone to help them, most likely, right? They wouldn't want someone to pull out a phone and film them. And it's like a loss of empathy. And this phenomenon, this loss of empathy phenomenon, coinciding with the rise of our technology in the digital era, has been heavily written about in psychological and scientific circles. They've done studies on it now because it's become a very obvious and worrisome trend for society. And it feels like, and I'm sure I've said this in videos before, we've been living in the before time of many of these dystopias, almost like they've become self-fulfilling prophecies that are magnetically pulling us toward a bad future. A future that if you ask most people, nobody wants to live there, right? But it's like we don't have any other image to look towards at this point, do we? I mean, that's I guess one of the questions that I have. The images that we are inundated with all the time and surrounded by all the time are images of a bad future that is going to suck. And very rarely are we shown a good version of the future. It's very rare for us to see those. I would say negative, dystopic, nightmare scenarios of the future outweigh positives at least 10 to 1. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. But we need to start getting some better images because people are foreclosing themselves to this apathy. They are basically giving up and surrendering to it. Just because WEF says something doesn't mean that's the way anyone has to live, actually. But the more we discuss that and talk about that, and the less we oppose it, the less we talk about opposing images, it's like it's going to become the default. A default for people who are saying your life doesn't have to be meaningful or happy. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? Who cares how much money these greedmongers have amassed in their little goblin caves in the depths of hell somewhere? Why would anyone, especially a majority of everyone, accept any of it for a single second? It's ridiculous. Why would we even remotely accept any of it? So we're lacking positive images of the future to combat all of this total bullshit that is being reinforced right now by places like Davos.
Give us adequate images. We lack adequate images. Our civilization doesn't have adequate images. And I think a civilization is doomed or is going to die out like dinosaurs if it does not develop an adequate language or adequate images. I see it as a very, very dramatic situation.
And when they try to show you some positive image, it's always something like this low Earth orbit hotel that you're supposed to nerd out to, which, if it even exists at all, is only rich people would ever be allowed to afford to go there. Meanwhile, people just want basic stuff like a roof over their head and food and health care and basic dignity in the present. That's, we can't, we're going to skip over basic dignity and give everyone a low Earth orbit floating hotel that looks like it came out of Werner von Braun's sketchbook or something. It's a little disconnected, to say the least. Okay, it's a little. There's a whole middle area between those two things that has not even been. They're just stepping right over it. Don't even care. So if we're in this before time, heading into this dystopia where we don't have better images, what can we do about that? I have never claimed to have all the answers, but I do have some thoughts on this. Empathy is sorely needed these days because pretending that life is just this augmented reality game where you're just helpless and nothing you do ultimately matters has been a pretty damn detrimental view the longer it's been taking hold of more and more people. Because it's through that lens, the nothing really matters lens, that all of this dystopic nightmare stuff comes true. Because if it doesn't matter, then I guess you can walk off and live in one of your choice of a number of nightmarish, horrifying futures because you said nothing matters. So then it doesn't matter if you live in abject hell because, right, none of this matters.
I'm sorry, Dave.
But it does matter because nobody actually wants to live there. So the thing about nothing mattering is pretty false. Something matters to every person. Even the most blatant psychopath has something that matters to them. Because it'll matter once you're living in the Hunger Games. Or it'll matter once you're living in 1984. Or it'll matter once you're living in Brave New World.
Happiness for all is happiness for each.
Fill in the blank. Empathy is the ability to see life through someone else's eyes, to stand in someone else's footprint and look at the world, try to look at the world from their point of view. even if it's completely alien to you in every way. I read an interview with P.J. Manny, who wrote a novel called Revolution, where everyone's empathy is at an extreme, which I have not read this book, just by the way, but in the interview was interesting. She was talking about how we're good at empathizing with individuals, but we're not so good trying to do the same thing for an entire nation or an entire ethnic group. And as Emile Bruneau, a neuroscientist at MIT, has demonstrated, people especially fail if the larger group embodies an ideology or a cultural trait or something that they personally disagree with. And what that really represents at the end of the day is a mass mind, a type of group think. The individual becomes sublimated to the group. And we've discussed the Asch conformity experiments before, but it's been a while and it's always worth bringing up again because as time goes forward, there's always new context.
It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
In Asch's experiments, there were people who were pretending to be a participant of the experiment, but who were actually in on it. The people who were in on it gave incorrect responses, and the purpose was to see, would the person who the experiment was actually being run on, would they change their answer in order to conform to the rest of this group, even when the entire rest of that group was wrong? And the person clearly knew it. To see if the one person at the table who was actually the point of the whole experiment would go along with the group once they started answering the questions incorrectly. Would they also answer the question incorrectly, just so they wouldn't be the odd man out who has to stand out and stand up to the group and say the group is wrong and stand against the tide? And what Asch found was that nearly 75% of the participants in these conformity experiments would go along with the rest of the group at least once, even though it was obvious that the group was blatantly wrong.
2. The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
Because some people cannot handle standing up to a group and saying you are wrong. They would rather themselves be wrong and then go along to get along because they cannot handle the pressure of having to stand up for what is right. It's very hard to do. In society, humans rely on cues from our environment, the principle of social proof, what is called social proof, for what is good and what is right and what is okay. Social mores, norms, things like that. What's everyone else doing? What does everyone else say? And we tend to use signals like popularity to tell us what is beautiful or good or right. Lots of experiments have been done on this, how this mechanism works. Over Halloween, we watched John Carpenter's classic In the Mouth of Madness again, which is a film from the mid-90s. It stars Sam Neill and Julie Carmen, and there's this moment in there where they're hunting down this missing horror novelist who's writing these books that are causing people to have mental breakdowns. And they have this short conversation in the car on the way where Neil's character says, the books aren't real, and that's not reality, so it's not worth considering.
What's so scared about it? It's not like it's real or anything.
And Carmen's character responds with, well, sure, that's your point of view for now. And the only reason that reality isn't real is because the masses share your point of view for now. But reality is just what we tell ourselves it is at any given time. So what would happen if the sane and the insane switch places? If the insane becomes the majority? It may be what's popular, but is it good? Is it right? Social proof starts to fall kind of flat there. But clearly, something like that happened at some point before everyone marched into these dystopias that we've been discussing. Clearly, at some level, what was acceptable as reality changed to that dystopia being acceptable by the majority. Because everyone's going along with it, right? In all the dystopias I've mentioned, the dehumanized group is always going along with whatever it is, no matter how tyrannical it appears when we, the viewer, or we, the reader, come into the story. The masses are going along. Why do they always go along? That's a big part of the problem, right? Because hiding in the group is easier than facing one's own self. Even if that group creates hell on earth, that's better. The only way to fight back against the group mass Borg zombie hive is self-individuation. It's timid nosce.
It's Latin. Means know thyself.
And knowing it so well that is stronger than the pressure of that group against it. It's going inside yourself. It's figuring out who is really in there pulling the switches. What are those switches? Why are they switches? Who is at the control board? What programs are running on that board? Did you install those programs? Did childhood trauma install those programs? Are they just running in the background in your sys tray and you don't even know why you react to certain things in reality the way that you do? Because it's one thing to say, well, they're manipulating people 1,000 different ways in our society, but that's at some level only because people aren't taking any responsibility for themselves in that way. They're trying to get somebody else to tell them everything to think and feel so they don't have to have any personal responsibility in that. A person who knows who he is a lot harder to manipulate. And I think that's why this society works so hard to grind the individual down. Or tell you that your one defining, distinguishing characteristic is a label that makes you a victim in some way, which is not putting you in a place of power at all in your own life. Because once you accept that victim label, you are by default at a disadvantage and triggerable, because now whatever triggers are attached to that label, they're attached to you. And you become like a wind-up doll or a robot to that victim label. Not to mention it's just another mask under which the real person is hidden or obscured. And I get it that the line, be the change you want to see, has been turned into a cheesy cliche that they use to now sell coffee mugs and t-shirts and what have you, but this is the sentiment behind that idea, that if people stand in themselves knowing who they are, they cannot be controlled in this way. And that also has a ripple effect, because there's a power in that. It's a powerful force. It can beat back the groupthink that would lead society to a hell of its own making again and again and again. I've been reading Carl Jung a lot lately. Jung. I've heard people say that guy's name several different ways, but I've been reading his work again, and I'm starting to think some of what the man said is more relevant now than it was when he wrote it, and perhaps more relevant than ever. And there's a really short book that if you get it, it's cheap, and you could read it very quickly. It's 125 pages, and the last page is only half a page. So it's a very short, quick read. It's called The Undiscovered Self. And the cover art, at least on my copy, is a man's head with a little man inside of it and a maze inside of that. So I just want to read this Jung quote because I don't want humanity to think its only option is to march off into one or another or a combination of these insane dystopic plots that we've laid for ourselves like there's just no other option. Because even in this time of incredible darkness, there is. So in my copy, which is the Mentor book copy that paperback says copyright 1957-58, this starts as the bottom paragraph of page 70 in a chapter called The Individual's Understanding of Himself. It says, all mass movements, as one might expect, slip with the greatest ease down an inclined plane represented by large numbers. Where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must of course be true. What the many want must be worth striving for and necessary and therefore good. In the clamor of the many, there lies the power to snatch wish fulfillments by force. Sweetest of all, however, is that gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood, into the paradise of parental care, into the happy-go-luckiness and irresponsibility. All the thinking and looking after are done from the top. To all questions there is an answer, and for all needs the necessary provision is made. The infantile dream state of the mass man is so unrealistic that he never thinks to ask who is paying for this paradise. The balancing of accounts is left to a higher political or social authority, which welcomes the task, for its power is thereby increased. And the more power it has, the weaker and more helpless the individual becomes. Wherever social conditions of this type develop on a large scale, the road to tyranny lies open and the freedom of the individual turns into spiritual and physical slavery. Since every tyranny is ipso facto immoral and ruthless, it has much more freedom in the choice of its methods than an institution which still takes account of the individual. Should such an institution come into conflict with the organized state, it is soon made aware of the very real disadvantage of its morality, and therefore feels compelled to avail itself of the same methods as its opponent. In this way, the evil spreads almost of necessity, even when direct infection might be avoided. The danger of infection is greater where decisive importance is attached to large numbers and statistical values, as is everywhere the case in our Western world. The suffocating power of the masses is paraded before our eyes in one form or another every day in the newspapers, and the insignificance of the individual is rubbed into him so thoroughly that he loses all hope of making himself heard. The outworn ideals of liberté, égalité, and fraternité help him not at all, as he can direct this appeal only to his executioners, the spokesman of the masses. And then he wrote this in italics. Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. So, this is that point that was made in The Matrix. This is that point that gets made in a lot of these films. And I think it's what is used in most of these dystopias in order to defeat the dystopia is when the person figures out who he is. He figures out where his power lies in that, and he finds a way out of that nightmare. And if everybody did that together, there's no possible way one of these horrific dystopias could ever take hold. It wouldn't be possible because people would realize where power ultimately lies, where authority ultimately comes from, where legitimization comes from of a system. And then there wouldn't be people eating the bugs or whatever it is that's being said about what's going to occur. We do not have no other option but then to zombie walk into a dystopic nightmare together. That's not a future we have to accept. And I don't know why people are acting like they are. Like every time something happens, they're just like, well, that doesn't shock me. I'm not surprised anymore. And I just don't care. Okay, well then if you don't care, then I guess you won't care when you live in one of these realities. I guess that's what you're going to get for not bearing any responsibility at all in the situation. Because if everybody knows who they are, they can't be turned in one of these automatons that just walks off into whatever dystopic nightmare has been plotted for him, by some guy in a business suit on a blue stage somewhere. I mean, that's it's going back to realizing who has authority over you in the most basic level, where authority comes from, where legitimization comes from, That's what happened, by the way, during the American Revolution. People stopped legitimizing the crown's authority. That's what it was. They just stopped taking that authority seriously. People delegitimized the crown's authority. That's what happened. And their consciousness shifted. How they looked at themselves in relation to reality changed. Everything else that happened later was just a consequence of that. That's the revolution. The revolution happened in their heads before it happened anywhere else. In fact, John Adams himself made a point out of this. He said the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the hearts and minds of the people. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. The fighting, war, physical, military part of it, that was way later. That came way later in the story, and it was way shorter than this part that John Adams is talking about. And people forget that. Or maybe they were never taught it. Maybe they didn't forget it because they never knew it in the first place. But if you didn't know it, now you do. The way they viewed the king, the crown, the power what that meant in terms of what rights of power were legitimate, what authority in that symbol was legitimate, completely changed at that time. And the people themselves, their opinion of themselves changed a lot. They rose themselves up consciously. Their view of themselves in terms of their reality and their place in that society, in that reality, changed completely in ways that were considered radical. And once they saw themselves in that new light, they did not go back. You couldn't put them back in the box of ignorance that came before, where they saw themselves as the lower sort that could be trampled upon, that could be taxed without representation, that could be treated in the ways that they were. And then they said, and we have inalienable rights. That means we're born that way, and those rights can't be transferred or taken away by governments. And by the way, here's the government's places in this world. That was a major shift in the way anything was viewed. And now here we are at this great reset, or whatever it is they want to call it, and another major shift is taking place. And all I'm saying is why do we, the people, have to sit here and accept a nightmare? Why do we have to sit here and accept a dystopia? We have all this technology, all this cool stuff at our disposal, and we're going to accept some dystopic nightmare. Why? Because it damn sure better not be just because some freaking dude in a suit in a blue room sitting around somewhere talking a bunch of buzzwords about synergy and stuff. Like, it better not be because one of those dudes found a way to make money off of it. And so we got to line his pockets by marching into his shitty nightmare future. Like, that's a stupid reason to have a dystopia, guys, okay? That is a stupid reason. After all these years, after all these centuries of moving forward in the world in terms of respect and rights of the individual, we're going to go that far in the opposite direction for what? Because the conveniences aren't going to be worth the world that that's going to create. Deep down, I think most people know it. That's the thing. I think a lot of people are just too afraid to say how concerned they are about the things that are happening, not just individual things, but the overall trend of reality right now. But somebody has to. Somebody has to say these things, because if we keep just all being quiet about it and pretending like it's la-ti-da every time another new horrible freaking thing happens, I mean, where are we going to end up? I want a better future for us. We deserve a better future. Humanity deserves better. Humanity deserves better than the world that we have right now. And there's no reason it can't be. Not really. Everyone wants to get lazy with it. We're going to end up in Klaus Schwab's nightmare land. And I for one, think that's bullshit. So are we just going to go along in the Ash conformity experiment or what? I guess that's my question. Because we could start making our own images about what this reality is going to be. We have that power. We have that ability. And I just think everyone needs a reminder of that. And I'm sorry if I sound like I'm scolding people over here. Just getting about sick and tired of this ridiculous stage play. Because it's not how things really are. And it's not how things have to be. I love you guys. And I mean it when I say that. I care about everyone. If I didn't, I wouldn't still be here doing this. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys soon.
I would like to solve the puzzle